In the early decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved to the region. The Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, leading the British and French empires to carve up the Middle East. The British took control of an area they called the British Mandate for Palestine. The British allowed Jewish immigration at first. But tension between Jews and Arabs grew as more Jews arrived and settled into farming communes. Acts of violence were committed by both sides. By the 1930s, the British had begun limiting Jewish immigration. Jewish militias formed in response, to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, which led many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanized much of the world in support of a Jewish state. As sectarian violence between Arabs and Jews grew in 1947, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states, one for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, home to holy sites for Jews, Muslims, and Christians, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, establish Palestinian independence, and end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. The Jews accepted the plan and declared independence as Israel. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as nothing more than European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many Arab states, who had only recently won their own independence, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine across the entirety of British Palestine. Israel won the war. But in the process, they pushed well beyond the borders set by the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. When the war ended, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named for its position west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this time, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel. Then something happened that transformed the conflict. Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war in 1967. When it ended, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had been fighting for decades. Israel and Egypt signed the US-brokered Camp David Accords in 1978. Shortly after, Israel gave the Sinai back to Egypt as part of a peace treaty. This was hugely controversial in the Arab world at the time. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in part due to outrage against it. But it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even without always signing formal treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this was when the conflict became an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, sometimes through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed all of what had been British Palestine, meaning it wanted to end the State of Israel entirely. Fighting between Israel and the PLO went on for years, including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the group out of Beirut. The PLO later said it would accept dividing the land, but the conflict continued. As all of this was happening, something dramatic was changing in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These people are called settlers, and they made their homes in the West Bank and Gaza whether Palestinians wanted them or not. Some moved for religious reasons, some to claim the land for Israel, and some just because housing was cheap and often subsidized by the Israeli government. Some settlements are cities with thousands of people, others are small communities deep in the West Bank. The settlers are guarded by soldiers, and their growing numbers force Palestinians off their land and divide communities. In the short term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long term, by dividing up Palestinian land, they make it much more difficult to ever have an independent Palestinian state. Today there are several 100,000 settlers in occupied territory, even though the international community considers them illegal. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration exploded into the Intifada, which is the Arabic word for uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycotts but soon turned violent, and Israel responded with heavy force. The first Intifada killed a couple hundred Israelis and over 1,000 Palestinians. Around the same time, a group of Palestinians in Gaza, who considered the PLO too secular and compromise-minded, created Hamas, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. By the early 1990s, it became clear that Israelis and Palestinians had to make peace. Leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords. This was meant to be the big first step toward Israel maybe someday withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, giving Palestinians a little bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. Hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords. Hamas members launched suicide bombings to try to sabotage the process. The Israeli right protested peace talks, with ralliers calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not long after Rabin signed the second round of Oslo Accords, a far-right Israeli shot him to death in Tel Aviv. This violence showed how extremists on both sides can use violence to derail peace and keep a permanent conflict going as they seek the other side's total destruction. That's a dynamic that's been around ever since. Negotiations meant to hammer out the final details on peace dragged on for years, and a major Camp David summit in 2000 came up empty. Palestinians came to believe that peace wasn't coming and rose up in a second intifada, this one far more violent than the first. By the time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. The second intifada truly changed the conflict. Israelis became much more skeptical that Palestinians would ever accept peace, or that trying was even worth it. Israeli politics shifted right, and the country built walls and checkpoints to control Palestinian movement. They weren't really trying to solve the conflict anymore, just manage it. The Palestinians were left feeling like negotiating didn't work and violence didn't work, that they were stuck under an ever-growing occupation with no future. That same year, Israel withdrew from Gaza. Hamas gained power but split from the Palestinian Authority in a short civil war, dividing Gaza from the West Bank. Israel put Gaza under a suffocating blockade, and unemployment rose to 40%. This is the state of the conflict as we know it today. It's relatively new, and it's unbearable for Palestinians. In the West Bank, more and more settlements are smothering Palestinians, who often respond with protests and sometimes with violence, though most just want normal lives. In Gaza, Hamas and other violent groups have periodic wars with Israel. The fighting overwhelmingly kills Palestinians, including many civilians. Within Israel itself, most people have become apathetic. For the most part, the occupation keeps the conflict relatively removed from their daily lives, interrupted by moments of brief but horrible violence. There's little political will for peace. No one really knows where the conflict goes from here. Maybe a third intifada. Maybe the collapse of the Palestinian Authority. But everyone agrees that the status quo can't last much longer, that Israel's occupation of the Palestinians is too unstable to endure, and that, unless something dramatic changes, whatever comes next will be much worse.